Hey there. So I have been meaning to do a video for several weeks discussing reading instruction. Most of us are several months into our homeschooling. Many people for the very first time, especially if you have preschooler, kindergarten, first grader, and you may be teaching reading or getting ready to teach reading or doing pre-reading skills with your child, and you may be wondering, what am I doing? Am I doing this wrong? Am I messing this up? Is my child going to be behind? You may have some struggles. Your child may not be sitting still and attending. They may not be able to write their name yet. They may not have their letters kind of sticking, even though you've gone over them several times. There's all just this huge gamut of different types of outcomes that can happen when you're teaching a 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7-year-old pre-reading or reading lessons. And so this video is all about expectations. We're going to talk about what would be normal for your child, what would be within the gamut of proper expectations, and what would be outside of that. And there are definitely children that fall outside of proper expectations, both in a positive way and maybe not so positive way. And so we're going to talk about what to expect and when to worry at all. So let's just get started. So many people, when you begin any type of preschool program, a lot of preschool programs are letter of the week focused. And so you have the letter, and then maybe you read a book and you do some activities, and you might start that when your child's 2 or 3 or 4. So let's talk about expectations for your 2 and your 3-year-old. At that age, it is absolutely 100% abnormal that your child would remember many, most, or hardly any of the letters that you introduced to them for a week. So if your child, if after you go through a preschool program and they go from age 2 to 3 or 2.5 to 3.5, if they are remembering the names and the sounds of letters at all, you're doing good. They do not need to remember even 15% of what you're presenting to them. If they're not remembering any of it at all, that's also perfectly normal. I want you to hear that. If your 2 and your 3-year-old is not remembering any letter sounds or any letter shapes, that is 100% normal. Okay? So if you're in that boat and you see someone else's child, they know their sounds, or they're like sounding out CVC words and they're 3.5, and you're like, my kid doesn't even know any of his letters, or we've worked on letter F for 6 weeks and he still doesn't know what it says. Deep breath, mama. It's okay. That's totally normal. And here's why that's normal at that age. First of all, our littlest learners are very whole body learners. Everything about your 2 and your 3-year-olds' learning development is experiential. It's whole body movement experiential. Children at that age love to learn songs. They learn to love motions. They learn through singing and moving. And things like letter sounds are so completely abstract. If you were sitting down to learn Russian for the first time and you were presented with their alphabet and you had no context for what an alphabet is, or that any of those symbols are supposed to have a sound, and you're expected to recognize them and distinguish the difference between this one and remember its sound, and you've never read even English, even if you're an English speaker in your life, you just hear sounds out loud, and the idea that there's a symbol somehow attached to that, if you really think about that, that's kind of crazy. So if you're 2, it's really crazy and it doesn't make any sense. And so some kids have great visual memories and great auditory memories, and they'll just pick it up like that. But the vast majority of children won't at that age, and that's 100% okay. Another thing to know about children, it just in general, especially if you're in a situation where you're teaching your oldest child or your only child to read, is to know that all children, whether they're 2 or 1 month old or 2 years old or 6 years old, they go through developmental surges is what I call them, and it's very asynchronous. So one thing to look for is, let's say you have a child that's really attentive and they've learned some letter sounds, or they've just not they've been keyed in to their lessons and they're doing a good job. And then all of a sudden they won't pay attention. They won't sit still. They don't remember anything that they knew from 2 weeks ago, and you feel like you've lost any progress that you made. All of those things happen all the time. Your child's going to go through these times where they're like all up in their body because their body is going through a physical developmental change. And then there'll be times when they're all up in their head when they're going through intellectual and developmental milestones mentally. So what this may look like is if your child is moving nonstop and they have a very hard time to sit still, if they are like doing a lot of jumping, a lot of climbing, if they're eating extra and you're like, oh, I think maybe he's going through a growth spurt, there's a very good chance that during that season that they're going through a big physical developmental milestone leap that they're not going to pay attention to, see, hear, or remember anything that is a visual or auditory abstract thing for them. It's just not there. They can't do it all at one time. And we know their bodies are changing just exponentially during these formative preschool years. So just be keyed into your child and recognize that if they were paying attention and now they're not, or they weren't and now they are, something has shifted. They've moved from being all about this development to this one, or vice versa. But it's very, very rare for a child under 6 to be able to go through all those physical developments and still simultaneously be able to perfectly keep up with their mental and knowledge development at the same time. Another thing to recognize in children under the age of 6 is that their vision is not developed. I actually read a study, it was about a year or two ago, and it was that a huge percentage of children in China are now farsighted. And there's this huge wave of children wearing glasses from as early as kindergarten. So why is that? It's because their vision at that age is actually not designed to be super up close, the way we would look at a device or the way that we would read. And in China, they do have very aggressive early education, milestones. They have longer school days. They have higher expectations than we do at a younger age. And so they push at those younger ages before their eyes are ready. And it actually causes permanent vision change and not for the good. And so what's important to know is if your 2-year-old looks at a piece of paper for 2 seconds and then they're off to somewhere else, that's good. That's what they're supposed to do. And that's why, like, anything that you would find in the general classical preschool, if you're using it with a 2-year-old, is like dry erase, 5-second long, and then they can go off and do other stuff. It's not meant to be full attentive for several minutes. So let's talk about realistic expectations. If your child is under the age of 6 and you're trying to get them to do their morning binder page or a math worksheet or anything like that, always keep in mind that the visual strength to focus at something that close is very, very limited. It varies by children. So you might be like, my kid does worksheets for 2 hours with no problem. That's fantastic. But I want everyone to know that when your child doesn't do them for 2 hours, that's okay too. It's also perfectly normal. So if your 2-year-old can pay attention to a worksheet for 2 minutes, that is the top amount of their attention span that I would expect for them to have. So if you're doing like a morning binder type thing with them, you might would hold that at you and let them sit away from you and point to a couple things and not necessarily expect for them to be able to attend and write and trace. At the age of 2, we also know that their hands, 2 and 3 and 4, their hands are not an adult shaped hand. The bones are totally different. The muscles are totally different. So if your child can write their name at 2 or 3, fantastic. But it's also totally normal and expected that they cannot write their name and that they cannot trace and that all they can do are like maybe some waves, maybe some swirls, those types of things. And there's some great graphics on the internet to kind of show you what's appropriate for a child at certain ages so that you know, like, my kid can't write an A. Okay, well, she's 2.5. That's okay. She doesn't need to be able to write an A. If she scribbles over the A in any way that lets you know she sees that it's there and it's a shape, boom, that's all. That's all you should expect from her or him at that age. So maybe 1 minute of attention per year of age. So your 3-year-old, if they can pay attention to a worksheet or something like that for 3 minutes, perfect. If the 4-year-old can do it for 4 minutes, perfect. 5-year-old for 5 minutes, perfect. Again, you may have a child that can attend longer. Maybe your child's attention span is a little bit shorter. Maybe you have a 5-year-old who can only pay attention to what you're instructing them in for about 3 minutes. There's a couple things to think about if that's the situation. First of all, it's not abnormal, so don't freak out about it. Don't think my child has attention deficit disorder because she can't pay attention. No, she may need to learn how to pay attention, as in have specific instruction and rewards for paying attention for a certain amount of time. The other thing is that she may physically fatigue to look at something for that long, and that's totally normal. There are great vision exercises that you can do with your child. Brain Gym is a little orange booklet that has like the lazy 8 type things, these things called cross crawls that your child does, and it makes all these different connections to different sides of their brains. Doesn't mean you have to do those things with your child, but if your child is lagging in attention based on their age, there are play-based activities that you can do to help develop the muscle of attending with their mind and being able to focus longer with their eyes. So don't think it's a problem that you need to be frustrated with. Think, okay, this is a little bit of a deficit, and how can I actively help my child to overcome it? There are also vision therapy videos on YouTube, that you can watch those and do those activities with your child. And another one is Diane Kraft has a brain integration therapy manual. It's about $85. You can probably find it used, and you can find a variety of vision exercises in there that are games for your child, but it makes meaningful progress with their ability for their eyes to develop. But I would not touch those remotely as far as like vision therapy type things until your child is at least 5 years old. So if your child just has a short attention span and they're younger than that, they just have a short attention span. So 1 minute of attention per age. If it's a little bit less than that, it's not an alarming issue until they're older than 5 and you're, getting close to 6 and you're wanting to start real reading instruction. And we'll talk about specifically reading instruction in just a minute. So just to recap, your child is going to go through developmental phases in their body that's going to impact the ability for their eyes and their mind to attend. So just be ready for that. Look out for those. If they're waking frequently at night, that may be a developmental milestone. If they're starting to have bad dreams and they didn't have bad dreams before, or vice versa, those are developmental milestones. If they are eating twice as much, or, then that's a physical developmental milestone. That's a signal to you that they're going through a physical body growth spurt or change, and therefore their mental acuity may be like a little bit diminished. If they're a little bit clumsier than they used to be, those are all signs to you that your expectations for how long they can pay attention and what you could accomplish in a school day is going to be limited compared to what it is when they're not going through those physical developmental milestones. So it's very important just to observe your child, make note of things like this, and just, they're normal. It's what it's supposed to be. It's not a problem. It's part of life. It's just that rhythm of their growth. So you're going to have seasons where you can sit down and you can do read alouds with your toddler. You can do activities with them. You can do crafts with them, and they'll be very in tune, and they'll pay attention, and they'll be absorbed into it, and you'll be like, yes, I'm winning. But the seasons that they're not doing that are not bad seasons. They are needed and necessary seasons for your child's proper physical, emotional, intellectual development. So don't fight against that, basically, is what I want you to do. So let's talk about reading instruction for just a minute. So your child may be 3, 4, 5, or even up to 6. Usually we start to think, oh, I really need to start thinking about reading instruction at 4. Now, I will say usually starting, and again, I'm saying usually, and starting around the age of 4, your child will begin to really notice if you've been exposing them to the alphabet before. They may begin to notice the alphabet in their environment around them. If they don't, that's okay, but a lot of them will. And so they might start asking you what the letters say. They might start to even pick up on some of that naturally, especially if you let them watch Leapfrog Letter Factory, things like that. If you've been doing letter instruction up until that point, just to give them exposure to sounds that make, or shapes that make a sound, then they may actually start to pay a little bit more attention and remember those things. So you start to see that transition over here's my A thing. I don't know what it means, but mommy said it's important. So I've dotted it or traced it or whatever. And their 2s and 3s up to 4 really beginning to notice it. Now, a couple of things I want you to know is if your 4-year-old is not noticing letters and still not remembering letters at all, that is 100% normal, okay? If your 4-year-old doesn't know a single letter, that's okay. We're not going to worry about that until 5, because a child, just like we all know there's a 6-month window for walking. Your child might start at 8 months. They might not start till 16 months. That's an 8-month window. And sometimes a little bit longer and a little bit shorter, those can be normal too. So just like there's that big window for potty training, my girl's potty trained at 18 months. My last kid potty trained at just over 3, okay? So we have a 1.5 year gap, if not longer, between when one child was ready to potty train and another child was ready to potty train. That same thing applies to reading instruction and just phonemic awareness. So just always remember that if your 4-year-old is struggling to even recognize that letters exist and that they have a sound, that's okay, even if their 4-year-old cousin that goes to preschool is reading CVC letters, okay? That doesn't mean that you have failed in teaching them. It means that your child is not ready to learn that yet, and that's okay. There is no difference, and this is I want to put up big exclamation points beside my head. Listen to this. There is no difference in academic or lifelong success for a child that reads at 4 versus a child that reads at 8. Okay? Your child reading at 4, if that's the case, that's fantastic. You have been blessed with a child that learned how to read very easily. That happens for many, many, many people. That's fantastic. Your child's 4 and 5 years old. But if your child doesn't really read fluently or independently until they're 8 or 9 years old, by the time both of those children are 11, they're on equal footing. Okay? So just remember that. It just takes time for some children. And I won't get into my own experiences with dyslexia and stuff, but I can just tell you, I stressed and cried and yelled and all of the things that you could do for years. But now my child is 14 and she is in the 8th grade and she reads on an 8th grade level and her spelling is improving every day. Grammar is not our friend, but who cares? She can read and she can comprehend and she can tell you anything that she's just read, as well as other children that are her age that read years before her they made no effort, So there's a lot of character development that comes along with learning how to read, both for mom and child as well. So it's not all bad. But just be aware that reading instruction will come when your child is ready. So I'm going to give you a couple of guidelines for readiness for reading instruction according to my own experience and my own reading. I'm not a reading instructor. I'm not a trained teacher. I am just an obsessed mom. That's basically what I am. So when your child is beginning to relate that this shape makes a sound, and they are consistently able to learn letter sounds with a week of instruction, meaning like my 3-year-old might learn the letter H if I stay on it for a month. That's not ready for reading instruction. Reading instruction time, whether this happens at 4, 5, or even 6, is when your child can pretty effortlessly begin to learn their letter sounds with a couple of days of practice. That's what you want to shoot for. They do not need to know their letter names in order to read. I do not care about letter names. At some point, they will pick those up. It can just be by the way. They don't need to know that it's named L. They just need to know it says L so that they can read. Okay? So not letter names, but letter sounds. All About Reading also has a letter sound app that's free if you need help making sure you're making those sounds properly and not adding extra sounds like la for L. You just that's just that. So quickly learning those letter sounds, because when you think about the amount of processing that it takes for a child to look at 3 letters, okay? So these 3 letters are out of 26 letters, and they have to instantaneously remember the sound of that letter and be able to do each one in a sequence without getting confused, and then remember back to the first letter and squish it together sound-wise with the other 2 letters, keeping all 3 sounds in order. That is hard to do when you really, really think about it. And a lot of kids will struggle at this age with, let's say we've got the word cat. Let's say we're where we know cat, and we're sounding out cat without a problem. They may have to sound out cat every time they get to it, especially if they're 5 and 6 years old, okay? So if your child is 7 or greater and they're not recognizing 3-letter words that they've sounded out 50 times before, there may be a problem there. Okay, so that's when your child is older than 6 and you've been doing daily, consistent reading instruction and they are not making progress, that's when there's a problem. Do not worry that your child has dyslexia or ADD or anything like that prior to 6 years old. Could they have it? Yes, but we don't want to be worried about it. But most doctors are not going to diagnose with anyone with a dyslexia until they've had at least 1 year of formal reading instruction. So just know that sometimes our expectations for what our child ought to be doing are based upon what we see happening with children that go to a classroom every day. Children that go to a classroom every day, their instruction is different. It's all systemized. There's not an organicness to it. There is a plan. There's not individualization, okay? So remember, if you're homeschooling, even temporarily, you have opted out of that system. Do not compare your child's results to the system that you have opted out of, okay? That's very, very important, because your child will respond to a teacher in a classroom amongst their peers. Peer pressure is real, both in a positive and negative way. They're going to respond to that very differently than they're responding to their mom sitting on their couch in their house doing the reading lesson. That's a good thing. That's why we homeschool. We get to have those intimate moments, but your expectations have to be appropriate based on your setting and the environment and the fact that it's mama teaching it and not a teacher teaching it. Okay, so just keep in mind you've got to keep their physical development milestones in mind. Keep these expectations in mind about a minute per age for attention when it comes to sitting down and physically looking at something close to them, whether they're copying their name or tracing some letters or doing anything else like that. Okay, please remember not to worry about reading instruction till your child is at least 5, until they are they are easily remembering letters after just a couple days of instruction. They're able to retain those letters past that week so that they're able to access them effortlessly. So for example, currently we're playing around with the curriculum. It's called Living Lessons in Reading. And I really, really love it. I love All About Reading. Stand behind that. That got my dyslexic child reading. And so if you have a child that is struggling to learn to read, I highly suggest All About Reading. It is so systematic, open and go, and it breaks down aspects of reading instruction that are not obvious to children when they're not obvious. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's some things that some kids just get that other kids just don't get, and they need it shown to them. And All About Reading is hyper detailed, and it does that in such a way that it makes it possible. But before you begin All About Reading Level 1, your child needs to know all of the letters' primary sounds. They get reviewed in Level 1 a little bit, but they're not covered. They have a pre-reading program. Now, I've used their pre-reading program, but it's not my favorite, because this is my caveat to All About Reading is I believe that it is disincentivizing to a child to learn all 26 letters, uppercase and lowercase, and never get to do anything meaningful with them. Because once your child is 4 and they do see and understand around 4 that those letters make up words, and words are what's in books, and words are what tell us things, they want to be able to do that meaningful thing with the letters too. And so the way the All About Reading pre-reading is done is you learn all the letters lowercase or uppercase then lowercase, or vice versa, and then you go into reading instruction. And that's a lot of labor for them without seeing that fruit immediately. What I love about some of the more Charlotte Mason or kind of, I don't know, old school programs that are out that are based on McGuffey readers or whatever, Living Lessons in Reading is one of them, and Foundational Phonics from Little Seedlings Press, is another one. What I love about those is it works on letters, their sounds, and reading at the same time. So to start those programs, you really want to make sure that your child is able to learn a letter sound in a week or even in one lesson. Ideally, you want your child to be able to learn it in one lesson. So the week is like the upper limit of how quickly you want your child to learn sounds. There are some children that can see a letter, hear the letter, they're good, okay? The older your child is, the more likely that will happen. So can you teach your child the letter sounds when they're 4 and then remember them? Yes, usually 1 a week. But when your child is 5, they might learn that in 2 or 3 days. And when they're 6, you could teach them 2 letter sounds in the same day and then be able to read some words with it. And so it's not about like finding a magic moment to start. It's just about having right expectations. The earlier you start, the more likely, not always, but the more likely it will be laborious for both of you than if you just wait a little bit later. It's just all there is to it. The older they are, the easier it will be for both of you. And so even though my programs have a letter of the week component, even though we practice the letter shape, and I'm a big fan of handwriting without tears because it helps them to learn proper letter formation. We're just learning that letter formation, and we're learning that that sound. And we do that slowly, 1 letter a week through the 2s and the 3s and the 4s, but with 0 expectations, okay? That's literally how I go into it. Like, we're just doing it. It's just for exposure. It's just to give us some structure. My kids love to do it. They love to recognize letters. They love to recognize rhyming words. They think that it's fun, and they love to do school. If your child hates to do school, don't do school until they need to do school. I feel like I'm rambling. I keep jumping around. But once your child is doing their individual letters and living lessons in reading, you might do 3 or 4 letters. No, it's like 3 letters and 3 letters. Then it's time to read a couple sentences. And they are so motivated by being able to use immediately what they just learned. But your child does have to understand the letter sounds, letters make sounds, and also that how to blend them together. So you may have to play some blending games in order to help them understand that, like at is mat. And so that's how we develop pre-reading skills before we start a program like that, is by just simply saying, okay, I'm going to say a word slow like a turtle, and I want you to say it fast like a rabbit or a tiger or whatever. And so I'll say at, and if they don't get it, I'll say mat, until they can start to hear those sounds and see how I'm blending it together. So you have to demonstrate that several times. But if your child can't take those 3-letter sounds and hear that you're saying a word slowly, they're not ready for reading instructions yet. So I just hope that that's helpful to, first of all, right expectations, okay? Take the pressure off of what a child in a school system is doing. That's not what you're doing, so you don't need to have that expectation, first of all. Second of all, exposure, and that's it. Reading, letting them see letters, talking about the letters, letting them know that the letters say a sound. That's all you're doing. Even how to build the letters. Can we build it with Play-Doh? Can we build it with blocks? This is eh. He says eh. This letter says eh. And that's just it. And not having any more expectations, not expecting them to remember it just because you taught it to them. They may not be in a place to learn it right now, and that's okay. So you're exposing them to it a couple of years over and over and over again. And then when it's actually time for them to begin reading, it will be the easiest, most natural transition in the world because you've worked on those letter sounds. You've played games where you've segmented words and you've had them blend them together. You've given them a whole word and had them orally segment it for you. Playing rhyming games, and as we do our nursery rhymes and everything in our programs, playing the rhyming games are so important. So just, mommy's going to say 3 words that rhyme, and you say one that rhymes too. Mat, cat, hat. Can you say a word that rhymes? My current 5-year-old, he could do that when he was under 3. My son that's about to turn 4 can't produce a rhyming word to save his life. And even when I say like cat, mat, sat, purple, does purple rhyme with cat, mat, sat? He's like, yeah, he has no idea. So they're 2 children. They've had this same teacher at the same time. They are developmentally very different. And so you just have to have right expectations. Otherwise, I would be concerned. Oh, no, he can't rhyme and his brother could rhyme. And is he going to have a hard time learning to read? He might, or he just might not be able to rhyme yet. That's okay too. So some big red flags for you to be aware of is if your child is 6 and you've been trying to teach reading instruction for at least a year and they are not retaining phonemic sounds, that's a flag. If your child cannot rhyme at the age of 6, that can be a flag. If your child cannot keep their eyeballs on what you're telling them while they listen at the age of 6, that can also be a red flag. Now, these could be a red flag that you need to wait a year, but can also be, at a point you don't need to keep waiting and you have to be proactive. And so my goal is just to always encourage you, just look for these things around 6. And if you've got more than one of those red flags, you may want to go to a developmental optometrist or go in for dyslexia testing and look into things like vision therapy, all that stuff, because they really, really do work. If you start to see any of those flags around 5, instead of necessarily waiting and not doing anything, you can begin some of the activities in Brain Gym or Diane Craft's brain integration therapy. That's basically the same exercises you would pay a therapist to do with them, and they work really, really well. Get your child, if your child is just giving you any symptoms of like, I can't look at you and listen to you at the same time, that's an auditory vision processing issue, start them on violin lessons. Nothing will help better than that. It's the best therapy in the world. But when your child is prior to 5, don't worry about that as far as like, I've got to freak out and do something about it. Just be proactive. And then when your child gets to 6, if they're still exhibiting those symptoms and you're not making meaningful progress, then you want to actually get assessed and work with some professionals to see what's going on. My very last tip is with reading instruction is to always end on a positive note. So if you're beginning reading instruction with your 5-year-old, and I don't suggest it prior to then, if you're doing it with your 5 to 6-year-old, you want to say, okay, I'm going to set a timer for 2 minutes, and we're going to work on this letter sound for 2 minutes, or we're going to work on blending these letters, whatever you're doing. And for 2 minutes, Be bubbly, be happy, be enthusiastic. Even if they're throwing shade at you, you're happy about it, you're making it fun. 2 minutes, okay? Fake it till you make it if they're being a butt about it. At 2 minutes, okay, we're done. And if they're loving it and they're having a fantastic time and they want to keep going, you are still done at 2 minutes, okay? After you do 2 minutes of reading instruction for a couple of weeks, as long as you are consistently ending on a good note, then go to 2.5. Do that, go 3. And so by the time your child is 6, my personal opinion is that you should never be spending more than 10 minutes on reading instruction. If you're using a program that has lessons that last longer than 10 minutes, I really encourage you to still block them up to 10 minutes. The most I would do with reading instruction up until 7 is 15 minutes. They literally can't pay attention longer than that. If you go longer than 7 minutes, even if they're obeying and they look like they're trying, they're still not learning after 15 minutes because there's like scientific proof. Brains don't focus for much longer than that, even as an adult. So start at 2 minutes, set a timer, always end on a good note. So if you're getting up to a 5-minute lesson and at 4.5, your child's like kind of crapping out on you and not happy anymore, and be like, look, we got 30 seconds left. Let's be happy and do this one more letter, this one more word. If we can get this one word one time, we're going to stop and we're going to have dance party. And then get that one word out of them, let them finish on that positive note, have a dance party, you're done with reading instruction. And if your child starts to exhaust after 4.5 minutes every day that week, the next week, move that timer back to 4 minutes, okay? We want to push their attention incrementally so we can grow it, but we do not want to exhaust their attention where they're frustrated, bored, checking out. We're getting frustrated, we're bored, we're starting to check out. We want to give them a fruitful frustration, not make them feel like they can't do it as well as we want them to, or they can't do it for as long as we want them to. You always, always end on a positive note. It is the most important thing I can ever say to anyone when teaching their child how to read. Always a positive note. So I hope that this was helpful. These are all things that I've just wanted to say for a long time, and I decided during quiet time today to just like sit down and say it. So let me know if you have any questions about this. I would be happy to answer them. I do have experience with a child with sensory processing disorder, auditory processing disorder, profound dyslexia, and dyscalculia. So she is why I have learned everything that I've learned. And then my boys are a little bit of an experiment where I can see all that I learned from her in real time through them, and see that the things I learned through her are very true no matter how abled your child is. So I hope that this will be helpful, and I hope that you will patiently wait for the right time for reading instruction, and that you will enjoy the developmental rhythms that happen along the way, enjoy those down times, enjoy those up times, and really just see the fruit of all of that